welcome you everyone back for the second lecture in this theory workshop. And before I hand over to Antoine, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming to this thing. I went to bed last night thinking, goodness gracious, that was something very special. I'm not quite sure what we've done, but it's something very special. And it really relies on the goodwill of humanity for people to generously give their time in this way. And I'm really, really grateful. I hope that all the audience here is really grateful for this, to have people of the stature of Antoine and Sanford and Marrikka joining me is really a very special moment. So I haven't let it all sink in yet. I'm not quite sure, but this thing has proved to be very special. So I'm really grateful for everyone. Anyway, today we have, just to remind you of how we're operating, we have 7 days, and each day one of us is going to be giving a lecture. I gave one yesterday. It'll be recorded if anyone missed it. It is recorded and it will be uploaded at some point, as will all of the lectures. And then we're taking it in turns. Antoine is today, tomorrow is Sanford, Kwinter. Then I start on the 30th. I do my second one, then Antoine, and then Sanford, and then Marrikka is going to come in on the final day, which is fabulous, to also contribute. Marrikka's here as a critic, and I should just say for those who don't realize that Marrikka just completed her PhD at the GSD under Antoine. So there's a connection here. I also want to say, just very briefly, to thank you, Marrikka, because yesterday I showed some work by Fernando Salcedo, one of my students, who produced that architecturalization you're showing his wardrobe making architecture. He tells me he was your student in Boston. So it's amazing how we kind of feeding on to each other and things. And hopefully there's a generation out there that will take up these ideas and propagate them further. Anyway, Antoine, let me hand over to you. I'm looking forward very much to this.
As ex-organisms, we are always implied
who's
Bing.
Who is talking?
That's Stiegler. That's Stiegler. I think. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Which is the ritual question before beginning. That's okay. Good. So let me share my screen. Share. Start PowerPoint. Okay, can you all see the picture, or rather the slide? Good. That's okay, Neil. You can see it.
Yep.
Okay, so with the rapid development of digital technologies, the most common question is about what they will be able to achieve in the near future. It is, for example, very common in higher education to listen and to read inquiries regarding the future place of online teaching, of massive open online courses, better known as MOOCs, as opposed to traditional teaching. But actually, the real interrogation should rather be what is truly irreplaceable in the physical presence of students and teacher in the same room, what is unique to the physical campus experience. And the present sanitary crisis has made us very much aware of the urgency of such a question. The future of education is probably not only Zoom-based, but knowing that we can do so many things with Zoom, what becomes the most urgent question is perhaps what should we continue to do in the classroom and on campus that we cannot do in the same way online. So of course, a challenge is to avoid nostalgia. In our contemporary world, nostalgia is a powerful feeling, much more powerful than what we usually acknowledge. So in a similar vein, for me, who has kind of a humanist perspective on architecture, the main problem linked to the rise of artificial intelligence has probably more to do with the roles that humans will play in the design process in a few decades from now than what we will be able to achieve with artificial intelligence. So in that way, I will echo what Neil said yesterday. Artificial intelligence is very much about the humans. So there are today raging debates regarding artificial intelligence and its real possibilities. Some see no limit to what it will be able to achieve in a relatively near future, while others insist, to the contrary, on the current limitation of artificial intelligence development and the difficulty that will be met when trying to lift these limitations. As Neil said yesterday, we don't have yet a general artificial intelligence. We have highly specialized intelligent modules. So perhaps worse than nostalgia is the tendency to underestimate the potential of the future for radical change. So I will assume in this lecture, as a kind of experiments of thought, that artificial intelligence will become a pervasive reality in design. And I'll try to examine, without fear or nostalgia, a number of questions that this development will raise, the central being, again, about the role of the humans in such a context. So we talk a lot these days about the importance of being less human-centered, about the need to treat non-humans with a fairness that we usually reserve to humans. But the truth is that we're still very much humans, and that we're more than ever preoccupied by questions such as finding and keeping jobs, being able to express ourselves. In some ways, the virus has reminded us of a very human condition. So hence my question, which gives the title to this lecture, what about humans? But before addressing that, I would like to begin by an apparently naive question. Why is it that we want so much to automate not only fabrication, but also parts of the design process itself? Why is it that we're gradually passing from a discourse on robots to a discourse on artificial intelligence in architecture? I'm really struck by how, something like still 5 years ago, it was all about robots, and today AI has become the hot new topic. After all, one could wonder whether automation will truly happen in architecture. If you take fabrication, for example, human labor still comes cheap compared to the machinery needed if we want to automate the building industry beyond fancy experiment. And this is probably even truer of the design process. Young architects are not that expensive, as many discover after school. So one of the evident limits of the third industrial revolution advocated by thinkers like Jeremy Rifkin and others is that overall humans are still one of the cheapest resources of sophisticated labor in the world. So it must be clear by now that what I'm trying to contribute to is a critique of artificial intelligence in architecture, certainly not in a negative sense, but as an open inquiry about what it entails, and trying to avoid both unbridled technophilic attitude and unchecked technophobia. So let me begin by automation from myth to reality. So why are we so keen on automating design, beginning with fabrication? The truth could be that automation is not an entirely rational enterprise. It is all the more unavoidable that it is actually rooted in something else than rational calculation. Or it may be that what we call rationality is never completely rational. It obeys impulses that we do not necessarily control. So we very often tend to believe that automation is entirely objective. Actually, it is grounded into something more profound that may have to do with a recognition that there are forces in the world that go far beyond the usual factors that shape our ordinary action and production. How to be plugged into these forces was a question that, for example, the Surrealist movement tried to raise through its practice of écriture automatique, automatic writing. I have a very good French accent, as you will discover. The reason I'm mentioning the Surrealists is not only because of their use of the notion of automatic writing and more generally automatic creation as a way to go beyond ordinary artistic production in order to tap into more fundamental forces, such as those that move the unconscious. Here it's a 1924 automatic drawing by painter André Masson. The reason I took the Surrealist is because among their disciples was a young intellectual who was later to become one of the major post-war French sociologists, a guy called Pierre Naville. After the war, Naville worked on automation in the industry, who was a keen observer of the massive transformation that were affecting, among others, the French automobile industry. But while doing empirical work on what was happening on workshop floors, he remained sensitive to what he had learned during his stay with the Surrealist. And he famously declared in a very influential piece called Vers l'automatisme social, toward social automatism, that was published in the early 1960s and was kind of, an UFO in the sociology of the time. And I'm quoting him, "I'm not far to believe, despite the violent rejection that it often provokes, that automatism represents an archetype as ancient and radical as our sense of symmetry or cycle, that it touches something intimate in us, a vibrant chord of our creative power." We talked a lot about creation yesterday, by the way, that has to do with enchantment, with our will to power, and many other impulses that move us, starting from our unconscious. So for Naville, automation was ultimately about this kind of quest, pursuit of automatism. It had to do with looking for a spontaneity usually reserved to natural beings. And I suppose, Neil, you'll understand why I raised that question yesterday about spontaneity. It was an attempt to make nature do by itself, through machines harnessing its power, what humans wanted it to do. It appeared as a Promethean quest that could never be fully satisfied by our technology. Machines harnessing its power as it could be. Wanted it to do. It appeared as a Promethean quest that could never be fully satisfied by our technology. There seems to be a problem with the resonance. Anyway, can you, Neil, is that, you can hear the thing correctly? It's disappeared. Okay, so let me move. So envisage from this perspective, yes?
I've just say I muted someone else. I also muted myself. I'm not, yes, no, it's fine, Antoine, fine, thank you.
Okay. So envisage from this perspective, automation is actually something far more fundamental than the ambition to improve efficiency. Or it reveals rather what may be the true purpose of our endless quest for efficiency. It has to do with a desire to create something that can rival nature, that can rival living beings in particular. Another way to put it would be to say that automation has to do with a desire to animate matter, to surround oneself with creatures that seem endowed with something akin with life, to life. So the most extreme form is, of course, when life is in some ways, this artificial life becomes in some ways similar to us. And this is actually an unavoidable tendency of animation. So there are multiple legends and works of fiction that illustrate this enduring character, this enduring theme. Think of Pygmalion, the sculptor who fall in love with a statue and then the statue become alive. This is a painting by Jérôme showing the moment when the sculptor and the statue fall in love one with another. Think of the Golem or of Frankenstein. One thing to note is that from the start, robots were inheritor of this tradition. Like their mythical predecessor, they were situated on the fringe where the distinction between the artificial and the natural begins to fade. And before the term was invented, already in the 1880s, you had an abundant literature on what would later be named robot. For example, a French writer, Auguste Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, wrote in the 1880s a book called The Future Eve, in which, it's a funny story. It's not Blade Runner, but it's an English lord who loses his fiancée and asks Edison, Thomas Alva Edison, to construct an artificial woman. Of course, today would be very problematic as a fiction, but by the end, the artificial creature becomes alive. Think also of Metropolis and its robot that seems endowed with a diabolical life. So the question of the relation between robots and life has, of course, known a new development with artificial intelligence and deep learning. It is, by the way, telling that the evocation of complete robots, artificial intelligence, oscillates between the profoundly non-human character of algorithms and the way humans, children in particular, learn. So this diabolical dimension of Metropolis the Metropolis robot offers a convenient transition towards a fundamental aspect of animation. It's ambiguous, transgressive, and finally potentially sinful character. For as we all have learned in any kind of religion, it's on God only, or the gods, who can animate. This is what the God of the Bible does when he creates man and woman in the Genesis. Here is William Blake version of it. And for humans, to animate past a certain limit is a transgression that can easily lead to catastrophe. Think again of Frankenstein. So let me return now to architecture, because architecture has both an intimate and complex relation to animation. Animation is, by the way, present in a number of funny myths of the discipline. For example, Amphion is about Amphion building the walls of Troy by playing the lute. And you can see here, it's a 17th century engraving, and the blocks are moving to put themselves spontaneously to build a wall. And it has to do, of course, with this question of animation. And it's something that we have forgotten today, by the way, is that the traditional analogy between architecture and music was all about animation. But animation is more ambitious than this in architecture. I would say that on the one hand, it's more ambitious and also ambiguous. On the one hand, architecture tries to animate matter so that it can enter in a dialogue with humans. I'll return to this notion of dialogue. This is what ornament, by the way, used to be about, to make matter, to animate matter so that a relation can be established with humans. But ornament, by the way, was not alone. Composition had also to do with this idea of, matter animated by architecture being able to enter in a dialogue with architecture. So the Baroque was not only concerned by this quest. You could say that, for example, Le Corbusier is very much still permeated by that. But on the other hand, animation in architecture had to be incomplete. Otherwise, it would have been transgressive. So for a very long time, the architecture had to do with animation, but an animation leaving aside the question of automatism and automation. It was a kind of immobile animation. It was in that respect very different from other domains, from technology in particular. So where do I want to go? That it's striking to observe how what has happened in the past decades or two may be characterized by a dramatic change in the relation between architecture and animation. Animation has become inseparable from the question of automation. It is pushing the limits of architecture. Think of the development of interactive spaces. I don't know whether, Neil, you're planning to address that, but interactive spaces may enable us to imagine architecture acquiring something like a knife in an almost literal sense. So what has happened in architecture could be in some ways described not only as a technological evolution, but as a reactivation of powerful mythical forces. One of my arguments would be to say that with artificial intelligence in architecture, but also with digital fabrication, we believe that we are in the ultimate form of rationality, but we are actually reactivating mythical forces. And this mythical character explains probably why the relation between automation and architecture is complex and even contradictory. Let's not forget that the power of myth lie in their capacity to host contradictory dimensions, just like dreams. We talked a lot about hallucination yesterday. Dreams have this astounding capacity to enable contradictory realities to cohabit. So automation in architecture is an unfolding process. So far, the most salient phenomenon has been the development of digital fabrication. I already mentioned it a couple of times, with milling machines, 3D printers, robots, etc. And with that, one has seen rising interrogation regarding the possibility of a true automation of the construction process, just like what one has seen in the automobile. Now, and this will be what I will mostly discuss in the rest of this presentation, we could very well be on the eve of an automation of the design task proper with the rise of artificial intelligence. So not only fabrication, but actually design itself. So under what condition is the development of artificial intelligence in architecture, in the design process in particular, possible? So let me begin by some basic conditions that will need to be fulfilled, probably, in order to have truly intelligent machines. That's to say, machines that are able to truly participate to the design process. So as we all know, we'll need big data in architecture so that machine can learn. And a number of designers around the world are exploring what it means concretely. For example, at Harvard, we have Andrew Witt, and Neil has mentioned a number of researchers yesterday. It's very striking, by the way, that doctoral dissertations are multiplying on the subject of machine vision, machine learning in architecture in relation to data and big data. And you mentioned already Emmanuel Coe yesterday. Neil, I was actually in his dissertation committee at the Lausanne Polytechnic Institute, and here is an illustration. So far, I have to say, the production of these algorithmic things is not totally convincing. It creates a lot of nonsensical labyrinth, a lot of cases, but still, it raises new questions. We may imagine that if they ingest large enough database of types, tectonic details, ornament, etc., artificial intelligence program may be soon able to produce design of their own. What will they produce? They may combine things that we don't combine usually. For example, to mix completely Baroque elements with modernist ones, etc. There are a number of questions that arise if we place ourselves in this hypothesis, which is a little bit what Neil has asked us to do. What if artificial intelligence is really becoming a reality in not so far a future? First question, will we be able to understand the way machine reason? It's not only a matter of algorithm, but it's actually, of course, we know that, neural networks, etc., have very complex and sometimes hard to figure way to make conclusion, but it's the elements on which the machine base itself that may differ from us eventually. We have already, think of the way different language understand already very differently the physical world. For example, I've done a lot of history of construction in French and in English, and one of my recurring nightmares is that the French word poutre correspond both to beam and truss. And this is still an easy one. So we are, this is also linked to something that we're beginning to observe, that actually machines see relatively different things from us. For example, in the urban domain, which is what I've mostly studied in the recent past, they tend to see, for example, instead of traditional flows, they see clouds of traces of elementary occurrences. Circulation is no longer a matter of traditional flow. It becomes a kind of molecular perception of what happens in the city. So what makes sense also for machines may not make sense in the sense that something that can be manipulated is not necessarily what makes sense from us. This is also from Emmanuel Coe. It's a series of strange landscapes. Many of them are perfectly nonsensical for us and are absolutely part of the way the machine think. So the historian in me would say it's of course a very serious problem, but it's not a new problem. In the 18th century, for example, one of the big questions, I like simple mathematical formula, but this thing, which is a differential element, was extremely mysterious for a while. And, for example, there were mathematicians who called them vanishing quantities. So what was a vanishing quantity was not completely sure. So the basic differential of calculus was very often seen as something that had no very evident physical meaning. So this is by no means a recent problem. And by the way, derived from the old Zeno paradox, which is that actually to think movement, you have to enter other consideration than the traditional integer numbers. So, and there were people in the 18th century saying, you haven't demonstrated a thing if you use calculus. You have to use geometry or arithmetic. So this is not completely new, but it's clear that we're in the middle of something, a kind of epistemological crisis at the same time. So that leads to a number of alternatives. For example, should we impose to the machine the same rule that we are following? For example, if you're French, should you force the machine to have poutre instead of beam trusses or something else? So should we actually force the machine to consider the same type of elements as we do? Of course, the problem would be that this may limit or even hamper the creativity of the machine. With machine following too closely our rules, we may have computer who will be able to produce tolerable Baroque churches of modernist villa, but is this what we want? So it's probably what the building industry will probably desire in most cases. So it seems to me that all these interrogations revolve around one central issue, and that's the main question. How will we truly communicate with a machine? In other words, how will we have a true architectural conversation with it? And there I'd like to really come back to something that has been was said by Alberti and a number of people at the Renaissance, that architecture was not only a discipline, was not only a set of buildings, it was a conversation. And this is what Philibert Delorme had in mind. This is the last plate of Philibert Delorme, who is one of the founding fathers of French Renaissance architecture. And this is supposed to be the good architect. And there is another plate about the bad architect. So the good architect, the big difference with the bad architect is that he's talking to someone. He's teaching. Architecture is a conversation, and you may note that even the building seemed to be part of the conversation. So I think part of the problem with artificial intelligence may be what kind of conversation do we have to do with machines, if any, that's to say, and a true conversation. That's something that means something in which not everything is predetermined, in which there is something like adventure in it. So this revolve, and we spoke about creativity yesterday, made me think about the question of otherness. It's, I think, one of the big difficulty if we want really to have artificial intelligence as a truly productive or creative or whatever, machine must not be too much like us. Otherwise, what would be the point of just talking to our mirror? But they shouldn't be either too different. So how do we manage this in between the radically different and the completely similar? This revolves, for me, around the question of otherness, which may be one of the most profound in creation. To create, it's very well known for everybody who's attempted even to write a modest article, but even more for artists or architects, one must allow something foreign to be born inside ourselves or next to us. In the Kabbalah, there is a moment also in which, God withdraws within himself. It's a he, of course, in the tradition, too bad, or itself, in order to allow the creation to happen. So we have to let the space for something other to arrive. And this other is usually in some ways has the relation to the I. And I was reminded of one of the most famous formula of the poet Arthur Rimbaud, I is another. So we could imagine this another to be carried by the machine, or rather to be born from a conversation with a machine. But this is once again a very complicated question, because if the machine is too much like us, there is no another. The machine is too different. There is no I. So how do we negotiate that, I think, is for me a question probably as fundamental, which has in some ways more to do, again, with a conversation than with the machine in itself. So now let me move to a couple of other types of problem, and then I'll try to focus on this question of what about the humans. So at this stage, I'd like to assume, just as an hypothesis, as I say, I don't care by the end if it happens or not. Or actually, it's not that I don't care, but let's assume that machine will be able to do more and more in the design process and in fabrication. And it seems also reasonable to assume that in most cases, we will still impose to the machine to consider elements and to follow rules that are somewhat similar or at least compatible with those that we have adopted in the building industry and in architecture, which means that even if in the depth of the machine, the elements which are combined and considered and combined are different, there will be an interface that will enable what I've called these conversation. So we've thought so far, and this is a very common thing, that automation would impact on the poorly qualified jobs. This might not be the case, and I'm very curious and eager to discover The Death of the Architect by Neil Leach, because actually I've been thinking along the same lines very often myself, or I don't know whether it's the same lines. This is still, to be discovered in the book, but this is also a theme that has intrigued me. So one of the reasons architecture may be more impacted than other practices is that it's one of the most formalized of all the arts. The mechanical part, as one used to see, is stronger than in other domains, and hence its traditional position between art and technology, which translated very often, you don't want to become an engineer, you want to become a painter, my son or my daughter, please become an architect, as a kind of compromise. So the very use of order and proportion by the Vitruvian tradition seemed already to be calling for automation. And this is something that Mario Carpo has built on in The Alphabet and the Algorithm, or Bernard Cash in his more recent reflection on Vitruvius' 10 books on architecture. In some ways, the much later project of theorist Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand to codify design procedure, and this is one of the most amazing plates for me in the history of architecture, which is the path to be followed for the composition of any project. So in some ways, a mechanical architect. It seems to be a kind of forerunner of the reflection on the possibility to use computer to design. And British architect Cedric Price approach to some of his projects seem also to announce the same thing, an era of machine involvement in design. This is, for example, the diagram for his generator project. I'll come back to this project a bit later. So it seems that eventually, once we've solved all the difficult questions I mentioned before, machines will at least be partners, perhaps more, in the design process. And it's quite striking how in the early age of the computer in architecture, it was actually a widely spread belief. Nicolas Negroponte Architecture Machine Group at MIT was, for example, really working from that perspective. So that actually one could perhaps imagine that the period during which computer and robots were mere tools will appear as a parenthesis in a long march towards a true cooperation between man and machine, which does not yet exist, but could exist in the future. So again, it's not sure that intelligent design machines will reason like humans. This means that as important, as I said, as their intrinsic power to produce design solution will be their capacity to enter into a relation, or what I've called a conversation with us. And this was, by the way, this idea of conversation was already present in the Architecture Machine Group. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why actually Negroponte Architecture Machine Group gradually turned to issues of interface and gave birth to the Media Lab. So if we're still trying to be futuristic, intelligence will, of course, not be limited to design proper, and construction will be impacted, so far, robots are no more than mechanical slaves. One may imagine that they could acquire some autonomy. And then it will be interesting to see whether conversation and even disagreement between these various forms of artificial intelligence may arise. Design could very well remain a conversation between whom? Man and machine, man and various machines, or machine and machine is a fundamental question. In an article I published some years ago in the American journal Log, I argued that even robots should be part of the conversation, this future conversation. As a provocation, I entitled that at the time, Free the Robots, because I was always shocked by the fact that, we tend to consider them just as passive machines. Will this attitude be sustainable when their intelligence will be greater than today? It's very striking for me, and that's a contradiction, to see that so many designers claim the heritage of Ruskin, but Ruskin and his followers try to give more autonomy to artisans and workers. This is actually a sculptor working on the Oxford Museum of Dean and Woodward, where two eminent Ruskinian architects. So before dealing with what could still remain human, and the human responsibility in this overall transformation, both of the design process and of construction, I would say a few words about some professional changes that this evolution might accelerate. So I'm very often struck, by the way, by the fact that some of these changes have already begun with the diffusion of digital tools, but at the same time, they are very often not scrutinized a lot. So first thing for me, a spectacular consolidation of practice. This is the practice of Le Corbusier in the 1950s, and you could be, the equivalent of today's star architect at the time with something like 15 people. This is now the top brass, only the top brass a few years ago of Zaha Hadid. Actually, what has happened is a massive consolidation of practice. What has happened also, of course, in relation with digital tools, which enable to manage very large groups of people, which enable to manage much more complex, organization in design than before, which enables also to work transcontinentally. The internet has made that easier. So, and of course, it creates risk. I mentioned jobs. It's true that in a profession that is more and more dependent upon the mastery of skills related to very complex programs, there may be the risk of an obsolescence of designers. It's very striking, by the way, how these big practices function mostly with people, young people, so there seems to be something which may lead to question about the future of the profession. Will we need so many architects in the future? Is actually a question that we may want to raise. Or will we need so many architects past 40 or 45? So now related to this professional transformation, we are beginning to see a profound redefinition of authorship. We can already see, we are, by the way, in a kind of contradictory moment with a kind of winner takes all star architecture system. And we all know that, speaking of Zaha, she was very typical of that, but we can also see more collaborative, distributed network form of authorship. And in other fields of design, this is, for example, a presentation of a ready-to-wear collection a few years ago of Iris van Herpen. And it was done with a collaboration of a designer, the architect Marjan Quality, and a number of people. So that actually it was a kind of collective production. So what does being an author means in these few contexts? So this interrogation about the future of the architect, professional future, leads to the question of what could remain specifically human in the future of design that I've tried to sketch. So it's not a very easy question. Just like the debates regarding quantification and its rise, it's easy, but not necessarily convincing to play the humanist. So let me try to explain why I'm saying that. A few years ago, For example, if you take urban data, it was still very common in the humanities and social science to say, guess what, all these number crunching will not lead to serious urban consequences. Today, there are debates about whether a new science of city is possible at the intersection of big data, data processing, more and more sophisticated data processing and modeling, etc. So it's no longer, you can no longer just say the city is too complex to be modeled. This is not sure. So you can no longer just say in architecture, you know what, artificial intelligence is just too narrow, just too elementary, etc. This is not a problem. Actually, this is a problem at least worth raising. So this will lead me to my final, or almost not final, but my central section. What about humans? So what is specifically human? And I think I will echo some of the things that Neil said yesterday. I think it's a complicated question because, as we all know, since we invent machine, there is something partly mechanical in the way we think. This was, by the way, the obsession of a philosopher like Diderot. Diderot was actually the son of an artisan, and he was very interested in the arts and crafts, the mechanical arts, etc. And for him, and this explains why the encyclopedia, which he directed, gives so much place to art and technology. And for him to describe a machine, the machine on the right, the description was actually made by Diderot himself. It's a machine to weave stockings, and it's a lengthy description of every operation of the machine by Diderot. And the reason that Diderot took the time to write that lengthy description is because he was interested in how is it that we invent a machine, and since we invent them, what part of ourselves is machine-like as opposed to non-machine-like. So this includes, and I think it was a question already for Diderot, the human capacity for otherness. Another way to put it would be to say that part of what characterizes the human is a kind of radical otherness that enable them to invent machine. And in some ways, the invention of machine may embody the I is another principle that I mentioned before. It embodies our inner otherness. So if we're partly resembling machines, including this otherness that I just mentioned, what can be unique to what we bring to the table in the design field? So far, let's be again, reassuring thing. It's worth noting that we're still much more a generalist intelligence, and the path toward the kind of all-purpose brain that we possess is still to a large extent unclear and hard to achieve. But there again, let's assume for the sake of the argument that we will have soon much more powerful and generalist artificial intelligence in the near future. What about the humans? So these artificial intelligence may not be able to walk in the street and interact on a lot of problems, but they may be able to contribute significantly to design. So what about the humans? Perhaps two things. The first is that we have embodied intelligence. Somebody, I don't know whether it was Sanford or someone else mentioned Damasio yesterday. We have an embodied intelligence. And of course, our conception and practices of the body are eminently variable, between these kind of ideal Renaissance proportion body to the country body. There are huge differences. But to be human is still to have a body. And this is so far a real limitation for robots and artificial intelligence. Because we have a body, we have emotion that mix the purely physical and the mental. It's a kind of mess, actually. Memory and most of our cognitive, this is what Neil developed a lot yesterday, but we all actually, we remember, when we see, we, to a large extent, remember. I was, by the way, interested in the fact that you called hallucination could be also memory. Actually, memory is a form of what you called hallucination. So when we see, we remember. And we are constantly, by doing that, mixing the physical and the cognitive. And finally, this is what produces relevance, and also this series of echoes in each other's bodies and mind that we call meaning. It's very telling for me that for a very long time, architecture was defined as what happened when building. One of the oldest questions was, what is the difference between mere construction and architecture? Architecture is what happened when buildings were able actually to connect with us through some affinity with our bodies. Moldings were seen as the equivalent of a facade acquiring something like the creases of a face. More generally, the symbolic was intimately linked to the body. So, relevance to humans. I would probably think that humans will have as a privileged task to decide what truly matters, to choose among a range of possible solutions produced by the machine, and to choose what seems to them the most relevant to humans. Which means, by the way, a shift from tactics, that's to say, leading the design process, to strategy, from the how to the why. A shift that has already begun to happen with the diffusion of digital tools, with a rise of parametric design in particular that may produce an infinity of solutions. Of course, there are optimization techniques, but by the end, what really matters is what are the questions, what are the parameters that matter. And the same is true in some ways with BIM, who intervenes and at which level. In some ways, I would say, to go back to this metaphor of tactics versus strategy, the conduct of the war may be partly, to a large extent, mechanized. But the why do we wage the war, or the series of action that we call design, it may be something that will remain, at least for a while, human. Which means that architecture may actually have a profound epistemological shift, which means that instead of producing object, it will become a question of choice, something closer to a form of action. In other words, the machine produces, the human performs, it acts. So the human make choices, and they have to do with this intricate physical and symbolic, the way the physical and the symbolic are actually co-emergent. I think very often the mistake is to believe that they're separated, and we all know that they're actually completely co-emergent. So the interaction between the physical and the symbolic is what makes possible ultimately to inhabit. One can occupy a space, but living beings, human in particular, have the relatively unique capacity to inhabit. That's to say, to define themselves partially through this inhabiting. So this may be what humans may have to do in the future, making choices about inhabiting. So in the lectures I'm planning to give on Wednesday, if I'm successful enough to be able to finish it, which I'm still hoping, I will return to this issue of inhabiting and relate it to the notion of materiality, envisaged as the way we relate to the physical world. So what I'm proposing may look a little bit like a kind of return to the phenomenological, with a difference. This is that it is not in reference to completely static conception of what constitutes the human, and with also suspending the fact that embodiment is something that may never be waived. I think we don't know. So I spoke about designers. What may be much more complicated is actually the future of labor. One of the reasons, and I'm always struck by the fact that it does not interest much digital designers. They're interested in Ruskin, but probably not for the right reasons, as if the future of labor was ideally, this is a still from the Swedish series Real Humans, about robots and humans. Is this really what we want for labor in the future? I think there again, nothing is dictated by a fixed nature. It is the product of constructs in continuous evolution, which means that the distribution of the task between humans and machine is to a large extent a construct, and it is a political construct. To be human is to construct women and men as political. And we have actually to go back to that. We need urgently, and this is one of the things I truly believe. I am really struck by how naive are sometimes digital designers in relation to the political question. I think we need urgently to define a politics of design, envisage as the relation between the various actors, and, you know, in a kind of Latourian fashion, but in a much more moderate way than Latour, I would include the non-humans. But I still think that the politics between humans should be a priority these days. And of course, how to associate non-human is the question I've been dealing throughout this presentation. So I started by saying, you know, automation and what's happening between robotization, artificial intelligence, and architecture, it has to do with myth. And myth has to do with poetics. And as an historian, I'm always struck that it was the case with industrialization. We have very often a tendency to tell the history of rationalization, of industrialization, as a history of rationalization. But it was much more. It was about plugging into a broader dynamism. It was about a poetics. It's probably too early to say how this poetic dimension will play out today. But let me note a couple of things. Usually, architectural poetics play on the margin of productive system, of massive productive system. It's interesting how the dream of a reinvented craftsmanship haunted modernity and industrialization, for example, and the contribution of Jean Prouvé cannot be understood out of this frame. Jean Prouvé tried very hard to be an artisan in the age of industry. And by the way, it's quite interesting that today the kind of neo-Ruskinian reference that we see in digital design may have to do with that. And this was also true next to Prouvé to a radical advocate of industrialization like Fuller. But we're probably deeply touched by creation like the Dymaxion car because of its bricolage dimension, which is actually so different from mainstream industrialization. So the question would be then, what will be the margin on which we could play to produce poetics in an artificial intelligence-driven design world? And it's interesting that it's not so much designers, artists, etc., who are interested today by this kind of question. You know, a possible path has been, for example, for a number of artists to think about glitches, to perturb the perfection of machine design. An imperfection that has again to do with a couple physical, symbolic, body, and meaning. It was, for example, present in reflection on Ruskin reflection on ornament. As Marrikka knows even better than me, Ruskin liked the idea of imperfection as something, the true perfection was the glitch, the imperfection that make ornament alive, which was later to re-emerge in Le Corbusier, who had an arts and craft education initially. And when Le Corbusier begins to rave at the imperfection of his concrete, his raw concrete, like in Marseille here, he is in a way reinventing the Ruskinian praise of imperfection. So a good question to ask oneself would be, what can imperfection mean in the new machine age? Something that has been repeatedly explored by designers. But since we may play with a machine a kind of duet, which the roles may invert themselves, you may also think about the machine producing disconcerting glitches and objects. This is again Andrew Witt. So, and we're back to this question of conversation and even negotiation with machine. Speaking of conversation, why not imagine that buildings themselves could have eventually something to say? And how about an artificial intelligence which would have finally a body, which would be buildings, homes in particular? And this was what Cedric Price had imagined with his generator project, in which the artificial intelligence is the building, so to say, which would be the ultimate form of animation, a kind of Frankenstein creature-like buildings. So ultimately, and let me re-show you, I'm almost about to conclude. I promised that I would not be too long. we might want to question also what will be probably at the core of the role played by humans in an artificial intelligence-driven design world, and this notion, namely this notion of inhabiting. The interesting thing with history that it enables you to pretty much question everything you take for granted. So are we going to keep the monopoly of inhabiting, questioning the fringes of established practice and beliefs? Reinventing the mythical might involve a critique of inhabiting as a monopoly of humans. So it could be, that would be the next stage of the future, after an immediate future in which we would retain inhabiting as one of our central prerogative and making decision about that. What about if we were to go further? And after all, we've never designed buildings only for humans. We've designed for centuries also a lot of buildings for human and horses. Or here, one of my colleagues at Harvard, Rahul Mehrotra, has designed an interesting village for humans and elephants near Jaipur. So design is science fiction, and movies, by the way, are presenting us with multiple images of life with artificial companions with whom we inhabit. Take Ex Machina and the strong presence of architecture, and actually an architecture which is literally haunted for the 2/3 of the film by this artificial intelligence. So to conclude, I would say that design is among the key dimensions that makes us human. And my optimistic side, I don't believe really by the end in the death of the architect. I think that the architect is dying pretty much generation after generation and always reborn. So I'm sure that Neil is actually optimistic by the end. We'll have to ask him. So design is among the key dimensions that makes us human. It will probably remain so in the new machine age that could unfold in the future. So what would remain ultimately human might have to do with the fact that we're never sure of what it means exactly. I is another means also that we really will never know what it means to be human. I think artificial intelligence, to go back to one of the things Neil said yesterday, artificial intelligence about what does it mean to be human? And the answer is, to be human is actually not to know what it means. And I think this is probably, design is among the disciplines who tell us that actually we're never completely sure of what it means to be human. And that's what makes it the most human discipline. Thank you all. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Antoine. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And I love the way that you kind of, in a very French way, I find kind of like you're asking questions. It's all based on I guess, a kind of problematization of the world. And you never come to a conclusion as such. And I think that's the beauty about the problem, because once you begin to recognize a problem as a problem, it's no longer something by which you're trapped, but you can begin to deal with it. But what I like about French thought, and I'm grossly generalizing here, versus German thought, on the whole, German thought is about finding a solution. Whereas I always find, certainly through the lens of Derrida, it's always about asking questions. And I think you've raised some really, really beautiful questions.
Simply, the answer is the question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but beware, I'm not sure it's completely French, because my colleague Michael Hayes, who very much like dialectics and doesn't like to leave things at questions, is using massively Lacan and Heidegger and Althusser. So French can be more diverse, as Sanford knows as much as I do. So I don't know whether it's in French. It might be the historian in me.
Yeah, no, it was beautiful, and I want to pick up actually on the notion of the dialectic, because this is something I think you were talking about, and I think it's incredibly rich, and it's something I think we've overlooked at our peril. I mean, I think there's another model coming out of the kind of Damasia's understanding, which is more homeostasis as a dynamic equilibrium, which is maybe a little more subtle than the dialectic, but I think the dialectic is incredibly interesting. And of course, one of the things I find so interesting is that, and you mentioned Pygmalion, you go back to kind of ancient Greece, is actually how already much of that thinking was already existing in ancient Greek literature. And what I find astonishing is how many of those sort of terms like Narcissus and so on, now Eros, Thanatos, I think all those Greek terms emerged in psychoanalysis as well. And it's almost like they remain kind of constant refrains in some way. And I'm kind of reminded in many ways of the dialectic that was going on in Greek thought between Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo is the kind of god of rationality, and Dionysus seemingly the god of irrationality. But actually, as you interrogate it further, you discover they're just different forms of rationality. But I love this. I love the idea of the dialectic, which is something I think needs to be kind of teased out more in many ways. And I think there's a dialectic there between stillness and animation. You see that also in Greek thought. The idea that Medusa turns you to stone, or indeed Narcissus turns to stone, and then Narcissus comes alive again in the flower. There's a continual Eros Thanatos kind of dynamic that is at play. And that comes out, I think, also in the kind of more recent Lacanian tradition, especially Zizek. And there's one particular example I love of Zizek, where he says, well, actually, what is the difference between the frozen moment, the photograph, and the animated movie? And what he basically says is actually they're part of the same thing, because what is a photograph but a frozen moment from within an animated continuum, and what is a movie but a series of frozen moments which are stitched together to kind of form this kind of this animated whole. And there are many kind of ways in which
I was saying, which is why Bergson hated so much cinema.
Yeah, just to mention, you also, because you mentioned Alberti, one of the things that, I mean, when we translated Alberti, it was in the age of postmodernism, and it came out in 1988 in a sense. And when it came to the question of ornament, we were completely confused by what Alberti had said about ornament. And now I think more recently I began to understand, you have to understand ornament and structure in Alberti in a dialectic relationship. Because at the time he would say, well, he wrote, what is a column but the principal ornament in architecture? Now that you could understand. I mean, in postmodern era, that was clear, very clear. But then he had this other comment. He said, well, what is a row of columns? What is a row of columns but a kind of wall with a series of holes cut in it? In other words, he had this dynamic understanding of structure and ornament as playing off against one another in a way that, I think we kind of need to be aware of. And I think one of the really nice kind of comments that in Rethinking Architecture is the way that Adorno critiques the very undialectical kind of logic of Adolf Loos, who is kind of championing one mode of operation versus another. And what Adorno is saying is you have to understand, I mean, let's say between the purposive and the purpose-free, there's, this art versus engineering kind of logic. Actually, there's a kind of false dichotomy in some ways, in the sense that even dance, which we kind of think in terms of kind of very much the social, cultural, and not the kind of rational thing, but even dance has a purpose. It's a social purpose, but it not has a purpose. So I think there's a kind of like, you ignore at your peril this dynamic operation. And often what's happening in discourse is you're oppressing one over the other. And it tends to erupt in some kind of way. I think that, to my mind, one of the interesting examples of this was in the movie American Beauty. And I forget the full story now, but as I recall, the father figure in this thing in the movie is homophobic, and towards the end you discover that he's gay. It's almost like he's repressing something in himself. And I really find that kind of incredibly interesting. And I think the way that Freud talks about the brain as being hydraulic is really an interesting kind of idea. So on the one hand, I think that this is a really rich kind of vein to keep tapping. I don't think it's out of date. Maybe there are different ways in which you can reconfigure that relationship, but I think it's certainly not out of date. But then I come to this kind of, the other question that you have is, how do you communicate with technology? How do you communicate with AI? That's I think it's a really interesting question, because in the end,
and I went further. It's not communication, because communication could be just passing a message, could be a cybernetic thing. It was a stronger thing. It was, how do you have a conversation?
Yes,
which
no,
means,
yeah, okay.
To be very specific, because I think communicating In some ways, I would say that, Negroponte moved from conversation back to interface.
Yeah.
And I think the interest for me is to have a conversation with the machine.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, so I was thinking. I mean, in a way, and I think I mentioned in my yesterday that the difficulty of how can you even translate anything. And I think I mentioned the bread. In Germany, a bread is got this kind of thick black thing that you build houses out of, whereas in French, the baguette. I mean, you can translate the word.
We have the black bread, which is very similar.
But there is this kind of, in the end, there's a fundamental question of not only how do we have a conversation with machines, but how do we, in a way, ever understand the other in terms of other human beings? And I think that is a kind of fascinating issue that was dealt with by
Neil, if I may. I think the interest of conversation is that you do not necessarily understand each other. You produce something together.
Yes, I know.
I don't think we will ever understand the machine really but just like a conversation, but when I discuss with Marrikka, I'm not sure I understand Marrikka. I think a conversation is a production. So what I'm calling for is actually precisely to move from a logic of the interface or a logic of passing the message or etc. to something in which actually we can interact in a productive way. And which was, typically, for example, the architect never completely understands the client, but together they co-produce architecture.
Yeah. Maybe just to throw something, pick up my point, but before I carry on a bit, just say the word computation actually means to think together. That's the original Greek term. It comes from computare.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's nice.
Yeah. But no, just to go take this.
Computare.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that Chow put the PDF of the camouflage book on available to everybody. But in that book, it's kind of one of the things I was trying to look at is how the issue of how we can ever understand the other. I mean, what is love? I mean, this is a fundamental sort of problem that Freud and Lacan begin to address. Lacan tries to resolve it, but in a sense, how do you ever understand the other? How can you ever love the other? And I think the resolution is the only way you can love the other is to love the other as a self. It's very complicated. But Zizek does this wonderful kind of comment, and he and Renata Selexel wrote a book. It was an issue of New Formations they edited on love, the theory of love. And at the time they were married. What was so interesting was they come to the very cynical conclusion. What is love? Love is the myth that fills the gap between the self and the other. In other words, love is just a fantasy in itself anyway. So there is no real sexual relationship from that point of view, which becomes astonishingly interesting as a kind of comment. So if we can't even really understand each other, although we have some kind of fantasy of the other we're communicating with, how do we understand machines? And in some ways, what I like also is that there's a kind of a comment that comes out of Lacan that I also picked up on, which was to say that there is underneath knowledge itself, there's something that he calls animate knowledge, or what you can understand as animate knowledge. In other words, before we understand something as a thing, we understand it in human terms already. So that's how we access the way of thinking, which of course, in some ways, we see that in the way maybe we start calling our cars names and so on. We kind of tend to anthropomorphize everything with which we engage, and I think, to my mind, the danger is even if we have this problem of really recognizing the dynamic of the self itself, how are we ever going to understand computation? Because it is something absolutely other. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is on when I do my second talk is really how do we need to step beyond this kind of human-centric way of thinking, of not seeing AI too much in human terms and projecting ourselves onto it, but accepting it as it is, and accepting it as it is, and also maybe even accepting the fact that we'll never understand AI. I mean, the kind of intelligence that it will go up with will go way beyond what we can even grasp as human beings. And I'm thinking here of the kind of that famous move move 37 in the AlphaGo match where nobody got it. And will we ever get AI? Will we ever be able to keep up with it? So, I mean, I think there's an almost, what I found in your work, Antoine, which I find really beautiful, is you have this kind of historical view where you sediment ideas, and you know, let's not forget the past. I think there's a lot of interesting kind of ideas that came out from then, and you mine those in a very interesting way, and I think as a very open-minded way. Not only are you open-minded about technology, but you have this kind of sense of the past. And let's not forget that the past, you know, Alberti was a kind of revolutionary. You know, we think about him in nostalgic terms now, and but I saw him as a revolutionary. You know, he was, and there's a kind of comment once that was on the Neues Museum in Berlin, as an artistic kind of comment was saying, in neon, it was saying, all art was contemporary once. And, you know, I think we have to also understand that actually the future and the past are actually connected in ways we often are not aware of. There was Wolf Prix gave a lecture once at SCI-Arc where he said the title he gave was Tomorrow, Today Will Be Yesterday. I think it's a really beautiful sort of comment. So what I love about your work is this kind of questioning, an interrogation that it mines the past and draws out all this kind of historical references. And in many ways, you know, I think a lot of these ideas have been addressed before and have been reconfigured in our contemporary world. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but I mean, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And I think in many ways, I think maybe the model of a kind of more of a dialogue. I mean, this is why the conversation we're having now, I think, is so is such a really rich thing. But there's also a dialogue that needs to go on between us and machines in a way that we need to keep it alive, shall I say? So anyway, I will stop there. But like Sanford yesterday, I was writing lots of notes, and this is something, I think, a conversation that could go on much further. But I want to hand over to my colleagues Sanford and Marrikka to get their view on things. So I don't know if Marrikka or Sanford would like to say something.
Go for it, Sanford.
Marrikka, that was my comment to you. Are you sure?
Yeah, go for it. Maybe I'll make one comment, which is that I especially given the fact that we're having this four-way conversation with somebody who wrote a book called Forget Heidegger, I was quite impressed, Antoine, that you kept Heidegger out of that, because it seemed like he was lurking in there a little bit, somewhere in between dwelling.
It's true.
Dwelling and
absolutely. That's a good point.
If I may say something about, oh, go ahead.
No, I was about to say, yes, but Heidegger as an inhabiting, which is a kind of more planetary, etc. My inhabiting is more linked. Actually, in the book of materiality that I'm about to publish in English, I discuss a little bit the relation between the way I consider. I have an inhabiting, which is much more related to the building and the making place, etc. So it's a bit less cosmic to say. But it's true that I'm kind of Heideggerian. I have some Heideggerian touches here and there. But
you might be a repressed Heideggerian. I worry about that myself.
No, I'm not at all a repressed Heideggerian. I say that at a certain point, by the way, that I'm very close sometimes to phenomenologists. What I hate with phenomenologists is this kind of fixist belief that humans are defined once and for all, that nature is something stable. The stability makes me very ill at ease. But otherwise, the world of sensation, the body, question of symbols, etc., is something I share with a number of, phenomenologists. Hence, past Heidegger, whom I never met. The complexity sometimes of my relation with people like Rick Wirth or Perez Gomez. But just as a comment.
No,
but I'm certainly not into dialectic. I actually prefer non-solved tensions. I believe that actually You know, I believe in the positivity of unsolved tension, and which for me is linked to another thing you said about the column. I think the solution of the column is to understand that ornament is not a fixed category of objects. It's actually an operation that subverts, you know, the relation between background and foreground, between the essential and the added, etc. So it's a kind of, by the way, very close to, you mentioned Derrida yesterday, very close to the Derridian reading in some ways of the pharmacon.
Yeah, I think
I think this is why the column can be both an ornament and non-ornamental.
But I think I think that's a really lovely way to kind of point out one of the themes that I really appreciated in what you were saying was actually the problematic fixity, I think, of traditional Heideggerian phenomenology, and the reason why it's not particularly helpful today is precisely because it falls too easily into established dialectics, which are fixed categories that don't allow for tension or irritation. And I think we know, ranging now over thought, even far before Diderot, but certainly including Diderot, that one of the ways that we produce liveliness in the world, or recognize liveliness, is to understand that things are in fact kind of irritating each other, or incomplete, or glitching, rather than falling into neatly stable categories. So I think there's a nice correlation between the way you're thinking and also what you're trying to think about that I thought was really wonderful. I would say too that one of the other dialectics that is deeply embedded in the way that we think about machine intelligence and computational intelligence and artificial intelligence, all of those things, even machine vision, simpler things like that, is the old master-slave dialectic that exists between the noble arts on the one side and technique or technology on the other. And troubling that distinction to me also seems critical if we're going to allow for a kind of more creative rapport to exist between ourselves and other things, not just the things that we would think of as being machinic, but also the things that we recognize exist in the world according to their own reasoning based logics.
Marrikka, can I just kind of pick up on something there, because I just as a kind of the Heideggerian question in some ways. I mean, I think that the fixity, you're absolutely right, the fixity of that, and there are other problems as well. But I mean, one of the things I find interesting, and I'm surprised actually that Graham Harman wrote his PhD on Heidegger and tools, because I find that one of the most problematic areas, to be honest, of Heidegger, in the sense this relationship with the tool is very kind of fixed and static. You know, either it's something ready to hand, or, you know, he has these two distinctions about whether you're familiar or not familiar. Whereas I really like the way that Merleau-Ponty starts seeing this as a kind of, it's a kind of proprioception going on. Over time, it becomes incorporated within your body schema. It becomes part of, in a way, the way that you think. And then the next step comes with Andy Clark, who we had actually at Digital Futures last summer in Shanghai, where he talks about this kind of cyborg mentality, whereby that external kind of world is actually because of the I'm getting some kind of echo here. So because of the kind of plasticity of the brain, we are able to absorb these things. And that's why humans are perfect cyborgs, natural-born cyborgs being the title of the book he produced about 15 years ago. That's what allows us to absorb these technologies and to, in an interesting kind of way. And this comes out of his earlier thinking about the extended mind, which is to say, why don't we include things like cell phones, mobile phones, in how we operate? Because actually that's where we store our phone numbers and our memories in a way. It's kind of an extension of the self and I find that's problematic in many ways, but fascinating. And I think we need to really move beyond this kind of static notion of the tool as something out there and something that we engage with in a kind of creative.
You may want simply to reread Le Roi Gourand and more generally anthropology. You know, because anthropology has precisely, this kind of take on the tool as an extension of the self. But I wanted just to go back to something which is, for me, I think it hurts, I was rethinking about the dialectic. I think what I don't like sometimes with the dialectic as applied to design is I don't think design solves problem. I think it stabilizes tensions, which is not of the same nature. I think, and that's for me, by the way, done currently about design and politics, to believe that design is a kind of super engineering that will fix problems. I think design makes problem visible, a kind of, a little bit like ancien aesthetic regime, and design actually stabilizes tensions, which is for me what a conversation does. A conversation does not end usually necessarily by, being of the same opinion, but having created together a common home or something, which is what a good conversation
there I think we
is
might
about.
need to be, but there I think we might need to be a little cautious about maybe the connotation that stabilizing has. Maybe we could say that design
Well,
could. So go ahead.
Well, it depends what you stabilizing, not as solving, as I say, that it's always a temporary stabilization.
Yeah, but maybe a dynamic.
Or a better analogy could be making them visible.
Yeah, but maybe
a little bit like the Rancière, design maps.
I would hate to think that design would be limited to making other tensions visible or problems visible, or even looking at the world in terms of problems that need to be kind of communicated. I actually think design is capable of making forays into the world that are themselves really productively problematic.
Yeah, that's where, no, it was more a reaction to the dialectic. It's true that I don't like in the dialectic the idea that you're going to solve tensions.
No,
that was just,
yeah, just to clarify,
that's one of my everlasting motive of opposition to Michael Hayes.
Yeah,
I think 100%. And I also think that it's worth pointing out, just in case, because I think this is often, we have a really like an incredibly large, obviously very enthusiastic audience here. So I think it's just worth stating something that I imagine is shared across the four of us, which is that architecture is not generally about the production of solutions to ready-made problems, nor is it about kind of simply creating more access to the world with its inequalities and its problems as it exists. It is much more a question of engagement.
Oh, this is why I've used this kind of conversational model. That's to say, conversation does not necessarily have a conclusion. And I think it opens, in some ways, it opens a space, and that's already a lot.
Yeah.
So no, otherwise I agree that design, I don't want to reduce design to an expression of things that would be necessarily outside design, but that's.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I want to be sure that we're not still in the mode of thinking that it's simply enough to point something out.
No, the reason I was saying that is, there are two reasons. One is because artificial intelligence, you have a lot of people. It's also because I've been working a lot in the past years in the urban field. And this idea of solution is extremely strong. Take discourse on smart cities, etc., urban intelligence, etc. It's an extremely strong tendency today. And through, and so the risk, in some ways, what if we could use artificial intelligence to remain more indeterminate and not to, solve, optimize, whatever, which is the big risk in the urban right now, but could be a risk eventually in architecture, because, you have a lot of people who are actually thinking in those terms. So anyway, perhaps Sanford may want to jump in now.
Want to jump in and feel compelled. Well, two different things. Look, first of all, I don't know if Antoine's aware of this, but I have noted in English the insurgence of a new term, and I found it incredibly humorous when I first heard it, and that is the term solutionism. And you can hear in the suffix clear sort of, whatever the word is, a clear sort of irony and, well, criticism, if you like, of the mindset that formulates problems in that way. And then, of course, accompanied by the smugness and the satisfaction of having done something, if you like, when one has proposed a solution to a problem which was never actually, let's say, justified in its formulation to begin with as an adequate one. Now, I would like to say, I don't know where to enter into the whole conversation. Like I say, you know, I'm here, in a sense, developing a very quick familiarity with the conversation as it happens in architecture, because I've sort of gone astray for quite a while pursuing questions, if you like, in other domains, which I consider to be absolutely central and germane to architecture. But I would like to say that one thing I notice continually as a kind of calling to myself based on what I do, and I know we have an incredibly sophisticated audience that is listening, but at the same time, I feel that fundamentals need to be, in a way, continually reaffirmed, or one has to continually touch base with them in order to provide a clear understanding of the landscape in which a problem is basically being defined, because it's implicit that the solution will also have that same, shall we say, character with all of its limitations. I believe, and I don't know how this adds to this present conversation, but at least it helps, I believe, prepare anything that I might end up doing tomorrow. I believe that all problems are, as they say in, well, in physics, are boundary problems. Sorry, guys, my dog is barking and my doorbell is ringing. I consider it the most important thing to do. Well, first of all, let me just say this. As we all know, global warming is a mortal question. We know that, for example, now there are other biological processes, such as the one we're all facing now, which is a mortal problem. I consider AI to be equally a mortal problem. And I don't find architects very disposed at the present time to consider it that way, nor to consider mortal problems as their domain. And I would like to say, first of all, I do. I think it's actually more incumbent on the architect to engage and to enter the realm of thinking mortal problems at that level. So as a way also perhaps to address this, because I heard, well, let me just say one thing about this conversation about Heidegger. I'm no different from Antoine, except perhaps that I have sometimes been more vocal in my personal disgust at Heidegger, but I have to say it's impossible to address these questions without the benefit of Heidegger. And there is no doubt I hear Heidegger in my own head whenever dealing with a question of, shall we say, human destiny in relation to the destiny of techne. I don't think that simply because the pathways that Heidegger created for us, which is largely to see ourselves separate from techne and at the same time to be inseparable from it, is possibly one of the most beautiful thoughts of the 20th century, or at least one of the most beautiful places from which to think that ever was produced in the 20th century. And I know that in many of my own sort of teachers, there is no doubt that that Heideggerian place was highly active. And I'll just invoke two for those who may be interested. The one that will be so obvious to many, and which will bring, of course, a quick nod of the head from Antoine, is, of course, Michel Foucault. In fact, I even remember when I used to try to go see Michel Foucault, I used to go to his office after his lectures sometimes back in Paris in the 70s. I remember one day he had that huge tome that had just come out I've forgotten the name of the great historian of philosophy, the great philosopher in France. He wrote about a 1,100-page book on Heidegger. And I remember Foucault was carrying it under his arm one day. And I thought, what the hell? You know, I was young, I was 20. I said, what the hell is Foucault doing with that? Why would he be, you know, spending weeks reading a book on Heidegger? The other one, of course, is a very far less well-known philosopher, which is the Canadian philosopher, George Grant. I want to say that, why? Because in a way, I believe that in many ways, even if it was only an affectation, for Heidegger, the human and the technical were mortal. They were mortal questions. And there's a gravity, and we should also say a call for penetration that is uncommon in architecture, even in philosophy, and absolutely missing in our theoretical environment today, which is really populated by one gimmick after another, and really crowding the field out from even permitting, if you like, those kinds of thoughts. So I would like to say, I need to reserve for the wonderful people in our field and for the young who are coming down the road, and actually for myself, the question of, and I'm going to quote Antoine precisely here, what is it to be human? I don't think that's a casual question. I don't think it can be asked casually. I don't think it can be addressed casually. And I'd like to say that, in fact, it is the question to which I basically have given myself over in the last 15 or 20 years. Now, I sometimes hide the term human because it's become so fraught, but I would also say that the problem of nature and the problem of the human are inseparable, deeply entwined. And sometimes we use the word body, as Antoine did. I mean, I know that Antoine came across a lot of openings and recognized in them a perfectionist, let's just say, of possibility, the invocation of Diderot, regardless of what aspects of Diderot one invokes, always carries with it, if you like, that framework, let's say, what I would call the boundary problem, because that's what Diderot did. So it strikes me as that the really important job, it's not for everyone, I agree, but it is definitely, I consider it my job, is to reconfigure the boundaries, because that completely reconfigures the meaning and the direction in which a problem would be pursued. To just deal with one thing, I suppose, that maybe opens a door for those thinking. I'm going back to some conversations that Antoine and I had back at Harvard quite a long time ago now, but they were central because, well, I can't remember what the course was that I was teaching, but I remember we used to get together a couple of times in other people's courses and talk about things. What is the, how to say this? What is the foundational characteristic in which the human could be conceived, and which is also, let's say, related to the problems that we're dealing with today? And I would say that because we talk a lot, and we are talking about, and I can tell the entire conversation is quite a bit going toward, as for example, I also have to say I agree with Antoine's refusal, shall we say, to mimic the allergic reaction to phenomenology, despite its critical weaknesses, that has characterized the architectural discourse of the last 30 years. And I just want to be clear about that. That was not clear to an audience that was maybe naive about that, because it's true, you have to be of a certain age to fully understand just how the phenomenological thing became a bad word, and why both the use of phenomenology in the 50s and 60s was a profound misunderstanding, or at least was based on profound misunderstandings, as was the rejection of it, and why today's recovery of it, it could provide us with a lot of directions, or at least, let's say, a better framework or a better understanding of what the boundaries, shall we say, which determine a problem might be. Where was I going with this? I wanted to say that there is a characteristic. We talk about, well, I would say that Antoine, in many places in his talk, conflated a certain number of words, and because the overlap was an interesting one, but it wasn't identified. Let's just say the domain of overlap was not identified as separate from the resonances that those words have. One was automatism. Now, I hope I can get back to the point I wanted to make here, but one was automatism in that initial text that was thrown up. The suggestion that there was something enchanting about an automatic response, but automatism typically is not given to the openness of to the indeterminate. Automatism typically is a closed system and a determinist type of system. It is actually not consonant with the types of behaviors, the types of magic, shall we say, the types of spontaneity that one knows in one's gut, because we ourselves are this spontaneous, or to use Diderot's term, sensitive matter. We are essentially evolved. We are essentially an exquisite sensing apparatus designed precisely to sense those parts of the environment which are capable of sensing, if you like, in that way, are capable of entering into that richness, that pluridimensional conversation that you guys have been talking about, which is the only conversation. I agree with you guys, but except that I would put the emphasis, it is the only conversation in which a political, social, and you could say biological life can be lived. But we've forsaken massive, let's say, geographical areas of that particular landscape. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just, I think it's a really good point you're raising, Sanford, about automatism. I think for David, as well as for me, they're the automated as a closed system, and automatism as a principle, a creative principle, or what I called yesterday a spontaneity in nature. And I agree that the line is extremely thin, and actually, I think it's a really good distinction you're making, because well, I think automatism, let's say, in other words, the quest for automatism is never satisfied by all the automaton that you create on the way.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right, but I would extend what you already intimated in your talk, and that was the crisis, or shall we say the boundary or the threshold, which is being crossed today, and which is producing, if you like, the demand for thought, is the penetration into the automatic of openness and indeterminacy. That is the AI problem. That is the AI problem.
Absolutely. Which is the Frankenstein question. To what extent, or, you know, the question of what happens when animation goes, you call it boundary, I call it usually threshold. What happens if you cross the threshold that separates incomplete animation from animation as, you know, something that could be an equivalent of life?
Now we get to the problem of learning, and I guess, I mean, I'd have to sketch out notes on this, but the problem of learning is an immense one. And in many ways, it has to do with a very, well, let's just say with an incompletely theorized relationship between it's history. Let's just say it has to do with storing what has already happened and activating it, let's just say, and making it available, if you like, to the future. Now, a fundamental, I don't know exactly how to do this. I haven't got the words this morning. I only slept 2 hours, but I would say that what is the There is a, okay, so somebody invoked what I thought was a complete false idea of Zizek's, which is the comparison of the photograph to the film. But in fact, we know the photograph actually is full of information. But for example, if you think about a musical continuum, which is, if you like, a temporal, shall we say, structure, just like the film, but a single note simply does not carry any of the information, or even an analogical amount. It doesn't carry any weight at all. It doesn't pull any weight. It doesn't do anything, if you like, in relation to into the musical continuum. So it doesn't operate the way a photograph does in relation to a film. Now that is because, well, the question of course is reality, is nature, is experience, is the problem, if you like, the larger problem, let's just say, of nature and its logos, is it really characterizable as the relationship, the spatial visual relationship of the, or even is matter even thinkable, if you like, based on that dominant model of the cinema and the photograph, or rather is it not in fact actually a musical, sonic, acoustic, if you like, continuum? Is human experience and the experience of time not far more embedded in those mysteries, if you like, that come from music? And in fact, does not the emotional engagement, I would even say the mortal engagement, does it not really reside far more in the model of music than it does? And why is architecture, for example, why is it so in need, if you like, or why does it persist continually in reenacting or reaffirming, if you like, that spatialist tradition, rather than acknowledging, in fact, as we do many times in everyone's talks these days, and in this so-called thing that we could call the phenomenological reopening, if you like, or basically, you know, if matter, and I mean, I'm going back 25 years when we've been talking about matter, we had no other, let's just say we, the materialists back in those days, we had no other interest in thinking of matter as anything but, as Diderot would say, sensitive or sentient, which is also to say that it moves us. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking, first of all, because I'm wandering. I have no idea where I'm going. I did want to say this. What is that fundamental fact of what it means to be an embodied human? And what it means even to have this massive cognitive and emotional apparatus that organizes our physical approach to the physical world. And that is the fact that the human brain must continually vacate and empty what has just been stored and has just been received in order to make room for yet ever new, if you like, inputs to be provided. In other words, we are always compelled to cause the world to move through us and to feel that motion and to structure it inside ourselves. I'm going to leave it at that. You know, perhaps I will go at this later, tomorrow, but that is the foundation of neuroplasticity that everybody invokes today. It is the foundation of experience. It is the foundation of music. It's the foundation of feeling. But it is also something that, for example, in our best philosophers, I refer to those as Spinoza, Whitehead, and others, it is what we understand as basically being the core of nature and the core of the mortal itself. Sorry, guys.
Don't apologize.
You know what I was thinking, you know, in between your photograph and film and what you just said about the world going through us, of, you know, Deleuze's book on cinema, the second one, especially the Image Time book, because it would be actually close to some of the intuition you were developing. But it's true that, as for me, you know, what it means to be human may be the central question, and actually what I've been developing recently is more the idea that actually design the fundamental question of design may have actually to do with that. And that's what I call inhabiting. Inhabiting is when we begin to get a perception, to get a feeling of who we are through the relation with, material, space, you name it, light, etc. And it begins to raise the question, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean also to be human? Because to have a place for the humans was always very much struck. I think it's Barbaro, I've been quoting it a number of times, the idea that, there are two worlds that we cannot inhabit. We cannot inhabit the realm of nature, and we cannot live with the gods. And
you cannot live what?
We cannot live with the gods. So transcendence is inaccessible, immanence is inaccessible, and what design does is actually to organize a place which protects us in a way from immanence and transcendence, and enables to create an arena for humans. And you spoke of climate change. I'm actually more and more interested. I have an article soon to be published in Architectural Design about the need to finally make digital and environmental question converge, which is something you've been actually advocating for many, many years. And I think, the kind of oblivion, and I think it is related to the question, what is it to try to keep a place for humans, and a place that enables humans to see themselves as humans, which is something which is neither given by nature nor by, the pure transcendence. And anyway, for me, and I think, probably this is, being human is actually, as I said at the end, is being very uncertain about what is it to be human. I was very much struck a few years ago by a conference of Daston on media, this terrible queen who kills her children, Médée in French. And is media human or inhuman? On the one hand, to kill one's children is the most unhuman thing. On the other thing, and we're back to the Greeks, on the other hand, to be able to kill one's children is an act of freedom vis-a-vis nature, at least. So it's actually nothing is more inhuman than media, and no one is more human than media. And for me, that's what humans need. This capacity to be constantly in excess or in default of, the common definition of humanity. Anyway, stop there.
Can I just ask Sanford one question, just to clarify? AI is a mortal question. What exactly did you mean by that?
Oh, well, I mean, I hope I didn't give you to believe that I meant something more than the absolute obvious by comparing it to climate change and to the great the pandemia. I simply meant to say that AI is a very dangerous, it includes a very dangerous set of developments, and that especially because we are so, shall we say, in this neoliberal age, we are so unwilling to take the time to understand, to theorize, and to think through, why do we even, why are we so engaged with AI? There's only one reason. There is really only one reason. It's an economic project. And
sure, you may also say that some countries are also involved in it because of power.
Well, not even some. I mean, we saw the demonstration yesterday. It's clear that China has understood something before the rest of the world, is that the control, shall we say, that control.
Let me pursue the question. What if actually what you call mortal was actually the essentially political question? Because for me, I think climate change, yes. AI, because actually I would say AI confront us really today. It's probably the best way to enter into a question with climate change, actually, what society do we want? And AI is at the center of a number of questions. Environmental change is at the center of another set of questions. They are actually connected, but that's another story. So instead of more, why not simply political in terms of, after all, politics is about life and death.
Can I just throw in one comment that Putin is famous for making? Whoever leads in AI controls the world. So it is a kind of ultimately a kind of social, political, economic question, a very deep-rooted one. I think he's right.
I think and we're going to see more and more. And I think actually, what is also preoccupying is the lack of debate on the urban realm, because we're talking about design, but where it's happening actually even more than design today is the urban. It's at the level of the city. AI has really started actually big, so.
Antoine, I'd like to ask your particular position on this. As a urbanist, or maybe former urbanist myself, I would have agreed 100% with you. For me, it was an absolute, it was a mantra. It was a mantra. The question always was, what does this have to do with the urban? But I believe with the transformations that our world has undergone, and I could list them, there's about 9 of them that are all foundational. But I believe today, I substitute for urban today the word social, the social realm, because I don't any longer believe that a lot of the geographical components that are carried with the term urban, or that are invoked by the term urban, are necessarily the let's say the pertinent ones today. And I'm just wondering how you think about this. Well, I know you're, as a European, but also who spends half his life in the United States, and probably fully aware of all the transformations that are happening all over the world, in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. Is the urban an adequate term? Is the urban an adequate term?
Yes and no. I would say yes, definitely, in the sense of Lefebvre, and today carried on by people like Neil Brenner. That's to say, the urban is actually a global apparatus of domination of the planet, which may not be only in cities. It's a kind of spatial organization. So that would be yes. No, insofar that I've been quite interested, and not only because of Koulas, actually, I'm not very convinced by the countryside thing, but the fact that actually still the planet is irreducible to the urban. So yes and no. But I do think the urban is actually a kind of mega system, and smart cities are actually part of that. It's an integral part of these urban in a kind of Lefebvrean, etc., which goes beyond cities. But I am interested actually in the return of what I tend to, very French, call territories. That the territorial is something that we've tended to forget. And the virus, by the way, is very territorial. If you look at the way it's managed, if you look at the way it's thought of, it's very striking how it's actually a territorial entity. So, the virus is actually strangely oblivious of the traditional structure of the urban, and is something of a different nature. So anyway, just that would be my answer. So as usual, a yes or no, because
I think it's really important. Oh, sorry, Antoine, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, please.
I was maybe double down on something you said. I think it's very in line with Sanford's comments about mortal questions and mortal issues, to avoid terminology that generalizes and flattens, actually. And that's my problem with the urban. It's also my problem with seeing the world as entirely urbanized, because again, like you said, we can't reduce the world to some kind of urban network in which the same rules would apply everywhere. And I agree, I really like the term territory instead, because it goes back to what Sanford was also saying about things being ultimately boundary problems. That there are kind of regions and highly differentiated moments where, you know, certain local things can erupt that can't happen in other places. And we know, and I'm not talking simply about the physical world and about geographical differences. I'm also talking about sort of points of thought and points of creativity. And one of the cool things I think about AI, maybe one of its also more dangerous aspects, to go back to what Sanford was saying, is the fact that it can intensify and accelerate certain differences. And push what might take a long time for an individual intelligence or even a group of intelligences to develop, push it very fast, very far. And so I look forward to maybe a more differentiated or maybe a bumpier notion of what the world is in the future that would allow for more difference to be cognized rather than having to be generalized.
To be honest, you know, to build on what you just said, every new technology is a promise of unification and ends up revealing different